Hi, I'm Dan Obashan, and welcome back to the joy of teaching tennis. Last week we had the short video where I gave you some of my favorite quotes on teaching, and a few of them, including a recommendation for an article, had to do with listening. And that got me to thinking about our L.O.T theory: listen, observe, teach. And over the next 3 weeks, we're going to do a deep dive into the L.O.T theory. Each week for the next 3 weeks, we're going to talk about one of the three aspects. And this week, we're going to focus on listen. Listen might be the most important of the three. And I think listen is probably one of the ones that teachers need to improve on the most. I know that in my life, if I could improve my listening skills, I think it would improve many, many areas of my life. I thought back to a freshman class that I had in college, a Psych 101 class. And the first meeting in this class was in a big auditorium, and there were hundreds of students in the class. And the professor came, and this class was one where you registered, you showed up for the first class, and you really didn't have to go back except to do these multiple choice tests. It was what they called a gut course, an easy course that you could take and get a grade without having to go to class. So the professor knew this, and he said, we're not going to talk about psychology, we're going to talk about something that will help you throughout your life. And he talked about listening. And looking back on it, it was probably one of the most valuable classes I ever took during my very brief college career. So why is listening so important? It's because we don't do it well. We hear, but we don't listen. Most of us hear the words, and then immediately our brain starts formulating our response to whatever we've heard, instead of listening to understand. Two people that came to mind as absolute pillars of listening whereas my student, Jeff Artoon, who I've watched Jeff interact with many, many people, and he's absolutely brilliant at getting on the other person's wavelength, asking questions, learning their history. He doesn't talk about himself, and by the end of the conversation, people really like Jeff, even though they might not know that much about them, but they felt heard. They felt that they were listened to. The all-time champion of listening in PBI was Chris Dyer in the headquarters. There's not even a close second place. Everybody loved talking to Chris, and it's because Chris was an absolutely fantastic, empathetic listener. Peter Burwash used to tell us you have to listen with your eyes, and you have to nod when you're listening and interact with the person so they know. Why is this absolutely critical for us as teachers? It's because we need to learn to listen to understand our students. We need to understand their knowledge, their beliefs, their fears. We need to understand where they're coming from in their headspace before we can correct their game on court. Without correcting somebody's beliefs, you're never going to correct their behavior. So you might tell them the greatest tips in the history of the world, but if they believe something different than what those tips are telling them, their behavior won't change. I can remember once I had this student, and we were working on his serve. And he was coming across as very arrogant, very brash. He's like, I know what the problem with my serve is. The problem is the toss and blah, blah, blah. But for that day, I was really doing a good job of listening. And I listened to those comments, and I really heard him. And really what he was talking about was his fear. He didn't want me telling him a bunch of things about his serve because he was fearful. And so I did something that's absolutely critical to listening, is I asked follow-up questions. We've all heard the interviewer on TV, whether it's I listen to a lot of sports shows on TV, the guy who asks a question and then doesn't listen to the answer and asks his next question. Try not to do that as a teacher. Ask the question, listen to the answer before you formulate your next question. And so when I was listening to this man, I sensed his fear and I said, have you had any pain in your shoulder? And he stopped and he was really surprised. And he said, yeah, a lot. How did you know? He said, I've actually had 2 shoulder surgeries. And he hadn't told me that. And I said, well, just watching you warm up, I noticed that you were having some problem. And I asked him more, and we got into a real conversation about his fear of serving because he had had so much pain in the shoulder. And I was able to help him. But I really think that lesson wouldn't have gone anywhere near as well as it went if I hadn't asked the follow-up questions, if I hadn't listened to the student to understand where they were coming from. So what other questions should you ask? Well, let's say you go out there and a very obvious first question to a student is, what do you want to work on? And they'll say, oh, I want to work on everything. Or, I don't know. Those are the 2 most common answers to that question. Sometimes you'll get a specific answer, but most of the time, I don't know, or let's work on everything. So you need to ask some follow-up questions. Well, do you play more singles or doubles? That'll give you a good direction. Where do you feel more comfortable on the court, at the baseline or at the net? What are your strengths? What do you feel your weaknesses are in competition when you play? Have you taken a lot of lessons? Have you taken lessons on that particular stroke that we're working on that day? The more you can ask questions, the more you will start to understand what the student thinks. And that's really a valuable thing to know. If you understand what the student thinks about their game, what they believe about their game, then you have a leg up on understanding how you're going to improve their game. So listening is the way to start in any teaching situation. The better you can become at listening, the better your interactions will be. From that freshman college course, the professor told a story about how in the business world they feel that billions of dollars are lost every year due to poor listening. And he told the story of a trucking company where the dispatcher told a truck driver that he needed to rush this delivery to Portland. And there's never been a definitive answer to who was listening to who on whether it was Portland, Maine or Portland, Oregon. But the bottom line of the story was the shipment was supposed to go to Portland, Oregon, and the driver, from poor listening skills or poor communication in some way, drove to Portland, Oregon. And after 2 days of calls back and forth from the customer in Maine, who was very upset about his rush order not making it, the driver finally called in and said, I can't find the address in Portland, Oregon, I'm here. So the listening can create enormous problems in every business environment or in every teaching environment. So that's the first letter in our Listen, Observe, Teach. Next week, we're going to talk about observing. So that's it for today. Last week, I started off, I wore the BNP hat, and I don't know if anybody made any comments on it. Not that I read, but there could be something in the comments that I haven't seen yet. And today's hat, it's a little bit difficult to see, but that's why I started off up close. And Paul Newman in England should have a leg up on everybody else for answering what this week's hat is. So go out there, be joyful, and listen to those students.